Henry, it hurts so much.
Please, doctor, my wife is in labor.
Not now. Move out of the way.
Please help me.
Please, doctor, please help my wife. Henry Jones stood in the emergency entrance, completely drenched from the storm, desperately holding on to his pregnant wife, Benita. Her water broke 20 minutes ago. She's in terrible pain. Please, just examine her. Benita cried out as another contraction hit. Henry, I can't take it anymore. I know, sweetheart. I'm here. Just hold on. Henry turned back to the doctor. Please, I'm begging you. I'm a doctor too. I practiced medicine in Nigeria before I came here to continue my studies. I know something is wrong. Please help her. Dr. Damian Shaw looked at Henry from head to toe. Then he looked at Benita. Instead of helping, he scoffed. You're a doctor? Henry nodded desperately. I was a doctor in Nigeria. I'm currently completing my training here, so I can get licensed. Damian gave a cold laugh. Then you're not a doctor here. Henry's face fell. Damian folded his arms. You people come here expecting this country to take care of you. Henry stared at him in disbelief. My wife isn't asking for anything free. Please, she's having our baby. Damian's expression hardened. Then take her back to Nigeria. Benita began crying. Please, she whispered. I'm scared. Henry wrapped his arms around her. Don't worry, sweetheart. I'm not leaving you. Then Damian delivered the cruelest blow. If you wanted to be treated like you belonged here, you should have stayed in your own country. Henry's hands tightened around Benita. He wanted to fight. He wanted to scream. But his wife was in labor, and his unborn child was in danger. So he swallowed his anger and begged one more time. Please, doctor, save my wife. Damian turned away. And that was the moment he made the biggest mistake of his career. Because he had no idea who Henry Jones would become. And he certainly had no idea that the desperate man begging him for help tonight would one day be the doctor standing above him, while Damian begged him for mercy. Stay until the end, because the way this story turns around will make you understand why you should never judge someone by what they have today. And subscribe, because you won't want to miss Henry's revenge, not through cruelty, but through success. To understand how they got to that hospital entrance, soaked and desperate, you have to go back 8 months, to the day Henry and Benita Jones landed in America with 2 suitcases and a folder of medical documents that meant nothing here yet. Henry had been a respected physician in Lagos. He had spent years in emergency medicine, had delivered babies in conditions far worse than any American hospital would ever see, had saved lives with his bare hands when the equipment failed. But none of that mattered the moment he stepped off the plane. In America, his degree was just paper. He would have to study again, sit for new exams, prove himself all over, as if the years he'd already given to medicine had never happened. He didn't complain. He took it as the price of a better future. He worked nights stocking shelves and days studying for his licensing exams, and every evening he came home to Benita, who was carrying their first child, and he told her the same thing. This is temporary. One day, they will call me Dr. Jones again. Benita believed him. She had married a man who never gave up on anything, and she wasn't about to start doubting him now, not even as their savings shrank, not even as the apartment grew colder in winter, not even as the due date crept closer and the stress pressed down on. They didn't have family in America. No safety net. Just each other, and the small, fierce hope that things would get better. Benita had been folding laundry when the first contraction hit, sharp and sudden, 3 weeks earlier than expected. She gasped, gripped the edge of the table, and called out for Henry. By the time he reached her, her water had broken. He grabbed the hospital bag they'd packed weeks ago, wrapped her in his coat, and half-carried her down 3 flights of stairs into the rain. The nearest hospital was 12 minutes away. It felt like 12 hours. And that is where we found them, standing in the entrance, begging a man in a white coat to simply do his job. What Henry didn't know yet was that his pleading fell on the ears of a doctor who had built a long, quiet pattern of cruelty toward patients who looked like him. Damian Shaw was respected by his colleagues, admired by hospital administration for his surgical skill, and privately despised by nearly every nurse who had ever watched him speak to a black patient, an immigrant patient, a poor patient, as though they were beneath his time. There had been complaints before. Quiet ones. A nurse who reported he dismissed a Mexican father's concerns about his son's fever. An orderly who overheard him mock an elderly Haitian woman's accent. Nothing had ever stuck. Damian was too valuable, too well-connected, too skilled with a scalpel for the hospital to risk losing him over what administration had always called personality complaints. Tonight would be different. After Damian turned his back on Henry and Benita, something in her body gave way that no amount of stubbornness or pride could stop. Her contractions, already dangerously close together, suddenly changed character. The pain sharpened into something else, something Henry recognized immediately from his years in emergency medicine. Benita's blood pressure was spiking. Her breathing had become shallow. And worst of all, when he pressed his ear near her belly the way he'd learned to check for fetal distress, the rhythm he heard was wrong. Too fast, then too slow. Henry's training took over even as his fear threatened to swallow him whole. Somebody help her now. The baby is in distress. A young nurse named Carla rushed over first. She had clocked the entire exchange with Damian from across the hallway, had watched him wave away a woman in active labor because of where she was from, and something in her had been building toward this moment for a long time. She took one look at Benita, called for a crash cart, and shouted for the attending obstetrician on call. Within minutes, the calm emergency room transformed into controlled chaos. Monitors beeped erratically. A senior obstetrician, Dr. Patel, arrived and immediately recognized what Damian had refused to see. The baby had shifted into a dangerous position, and Benita's vitals were crashing. There was no time for hesitation. "We need to get her into surgery immediately," Dr. Patel said. "She's losing too much blood. If we wait any longer, we could lose them both." Henry stood frozen at the edge of the room, every instinct as a doctor screaming at him that this was exactly the kind of moment where minutes decided lives, and every instinct as a husband screaming louder, terrified that he was about to lose everything that mattered to him. They wheeled Benita away. The double doors swung shut, and Henry Jones, a man who had once calmly guided frightened patients through their worst nights in a Lagos hospital, now stood in a hallway in America with no control over anything, praying in a language that came from somewhere deeper than words. The next 40 minutes were the longest of his life. Nurses moved past him without meeting his eyes. Machines hummed somewhere behind closed doors. He thought about every argument he'd had with Benita, every small moment of tenderness, every promise he had made her when they decided to leave Nigeria together. He thought about the daughter they hadn't met yet, and whether she would ever get the chance to exist outside her mother's body. "She made it," Dr. Patel said. "Both of them made it. It was close. Very close. But your wife is strong, and your daughter is strong too." Henry's knees nearly gave out. He pressed his hands to his face and wept, right there in the hallway, not caring who saw him. Their daughter was born at 2:47 in the morning, small but healthy, with a cry loud enough to fill the entire wing. Benita, pale and exhausted but alive, held her for the first time an hour later, and Henry stood beside them both, unable to speak, overwhelmed by a relief so total it felt like drowning in reverse. What began as the worst night of their lives had become, in the span of a few terrifying hours, one of the most important nights either of them would ever live through. But the story wasn't finished. Not even close. Because while Henry and Benita held their newborn daughter, something else was happening on the other side of the hospital. Carla, the young nurse who had rushed to Benita's side, walked straight into the office of the hospital's patient advocacy department and reported everything she had witnessed. She wasn't the only one. 2 other staff members who had overheard Damian's comments came forward that same night, describing in detail how he had refused to examine a woman in active labor, mocked her husband's medical. By morning, hospital administration had a formal complaint on their desks, and it wasn't the first one with Damian Shaw's name attached to it. When they pulled his file, they found a pattern stretching back years. Quiet complaints that had been buried, smoothed over, excused because of his surgical reputation. This time, with a newborn's medical chart showing exactly how close things had come to catastrophe, there was no smoothing it over. An internal investigation was opened immediately. Damian wasn't worried. Not at first. He had weathered complaints before. He assumed, as he always had, that his standing in the hospital would protect him, and that the immigrant family from the night before had no power to touch a man like him. He had no idea how wrong he was. Because Henry Jones was not simply a struggling man working odd jobs while he waited for a licensing exam. What Damian never bothered to ask, what he never cared enough to learn, was that Henry's medical record in Nigeria was extraordinary. Years of emergency medicine experience. A history of saving patients in hospitals that had a fraction of the resources America took for granted. Henry had already passed the first stage of his American licensing exams months earlier, and just weeks before that stormy night, he had been quietly selected for a competitive physician fellowship, one reserved for candidates whose prior experience and performance marked them as exceptional. The hospital's own medical leadership already had his name on file, already had plans to bring him on once his licensing was finalized. Damian Shaw had looked at a man in soaked clothes clutching his laboring wife and decided he knew everything about him. He had been catastrophically wrong. When the investigation team reviewed the incident, they didn't just find a doctor who had been rude. They found a doctor who had endangered 2 patients through deliberate neglect, motivated by prejudice, and whose conduct that night had nearly resulted in the deaths of a mother and her newborn child. Combined with his prior history, the hospital's board moved quickly. Within weeks, Damian Shaw's medical privileges at the hospital were suspended pending a full review by the state medical board. The man who once believed himself untouchable was suddenly very touchable indeed. Meanwhile, Henry's life was moving in the opposite direction. He completed his licensing exams that same season, passing with distinction. The fellowship he had been selected for became official. And in a twist that felt almost too poetic to be real, the position was based at the very hospital where his daughter had been born, the same hospital where a man had once told him to go back to his own country. The day Henry walked through those doors wearing a white coat with his own name stitched above the pocket, something in him settled that had been unsettled since the day he left Lagos. He was, once again, Dr. Jones. Word spread quickly through the hospital staff, most of whom already knew exactly who he was and exactly what had happened to his wife on the night they met Dr. Shaw. Nurses who had once treated him with quiet pity now greeted him with genuine respect. Carla, the nurse who had saved Benita's life with her quick thinking, became one of his closest colleagues. And then came the moment none of them, especially Damian, ever expected. For a long moment, Damian simply stared, unable to reconcile the man in front of him with the memory of the drenched, begging stranger from that stormy night. Henry looked up and met his eyes without anger, without triumph, simply with the quiet steadiness of a man who had nothing left to prove. Damian's mouth opened, and what came out surprised even him. "Sir, I didn't realize." The word hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them expected. The same man Damian had once told wasn't a real doctor was now the physician standing in front of him, addressing him with the respect he had once refused to offer a desperate father and his laboring wife. Damian lowered his eyes. "I owe you an apology. I owe your wife an apology. What I did that night, there's no excuse for it. I could have gotten both of you killed." Henry studied him for a moment. He thought about the terror of that night, the sound of Benita crying out, the helplessness of being dismissed by the one person who could have helped them. He thought about how easily things could have gone differently, how close he had come to losing everything. But he also thought about the kind of man he wanted to be and the kind of father he wanted his daughter to grow up watching. "You're right," Henry said quietly. "There's no excuse. My wife almost died that night. My daughter almost never got the chance to live. You made a choice based on nothing but the way we looked and where we came from, and it nearly cost us everything. But I'm not interested in destroying you the way you tried to make me feel worthless," Henry continued. "I don't need revenge. I have my wife. I have my daughter. I have the career I worked for. What you do with the rest of your life is between you and the people you answer to now." He turned and walked back toward his patients, leaving Damian standing alone in the hallway with nothing but the weight of his own choices. The state medical board's review concluded a few months later. Damian Shaw lost his license to practice medicine in that state, a consequence not just of one night, but of a pattern he had been allowed to hide behind his talent for far too long. The man who once believed his status made him untouchable discovered. Too late. That reputation built on cruelty eventually collapses under its own weight. Henry and Benita's life, meanwhile, only continued to grow. Henry became one of the hospital's most respected physicians, known not only for his skill, but for the particular gentleness he showed immigrant and low-income patients, the ones who often walked into hospitals afraid of being dismissed the way he once had been. He started a small outreach program specifically to help pregnant women in vulnerable situations get the care they needed without fear or shame, a direct answer to the worst night of his life. Benita recovered fully and eventually built her own career, drawing on the strength she'd shown that stormy night to help other new immigrant families find their footing in a country that hadn't always been kind to them. Their daughter grew up surrounded by love, healthy and thriving, never knowing how close she had come to not existing at all, only knowing that her parents had built a beautiful life out of the hardest night of their story. Years later, Henry and Benita walked back through the doors of that same hospital together, their daughter's small hand in Henry's, on their way to a hospital gala honoring the outreach program he had built. The same entrance where a desperate father had once begged for his wife's life was now just another doorway into an ordinary, beautiful evening. People may judge you by what you have today, but they will never know what you are becoming. Damian Shaw looked at a soaked, desperate immigrant and saw someone he believed didn't matter. He never imagined that the man he dismissed would one day stand above him, not with cruelty, but with quiet, unshakable dignity, the very thing Damian himself had never learned to offer anyone at all.